He left the voice note on by mistake. That is the only reason Clara Whitmore ever heard what her husband James truly thought of her. Not what he said to her face, not what he performed at dinner parties, but the real thing, the unguarded thing, the version of his opinion he reserved for his friend Philip on a Tuesday night, when he was certain, absolutely certain, that no woman was listening. She was standing in a ballroom when it arrived. A charity gala, champagne, candlelight, the low sound of an orchestra tuning somewhere behind a curtain. She was holding a glass of sparkling water because James controlled their joint account, and she hadn't wanted to spend on wine. She was wearing a dress that wasn't hers, and somewhere across that glittering room, her husband was laughing with people who mattered to him, completely unaware that his phone was still recording. What James did not know, what none of the people in that room could possibly have known, was that the gala they were all standing in, every flower arrangement, every candlestick, every inch of that ballroom, existed because of Clara. Not James, not his family, not Arcadia Capital or any of the polished, successful people he spent his evenings performing for. Clara. Specifically, the $90 million estate her grandmother left her, quietly, deliberately, and entirely outside the reach of the man who was, at that precise moment, telling his friend Philip exactly what he thought she was worth. This isn't just a story about a voice note. It's about what happens when a woman is counted out in a room she already owns. If you believe that patience is its own kind of power, hit like before we go any further, and subscribe, because this community shows up for every woman in this story. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what happened in that ballroom, we need to go back to where this really began, to a woman named Rosalind, a beach house on the Carolina coast, and a lesson about silence that her granddaughter almost forgot she'd learned. He left the voice note on by mistake. That is the only reason Clara Whitmore ever heard what her husband James truly thought of her. Not what he said to her face, not what he performed at dinner parties, but the real thing, the unguarded thing, the version of his opinion he reserved for his friend Philip on a Tuesday night, when he was certain, absolutely certain, that no woman was listening. She was standing in a ballroom when it arrived. A charity gala, champagne, candlelight, the low sound of an orchestra tuning somewhere behind a curtain. She was holding a glass of sparkling water because James controlled their joint account, and she hadn't wanted to spend on wine. She was wearing a dress that wasn't hers. And somewhere across that glittering room, her husband was laughing with people who mattered to him, completely unaware that his phone was still recording. What James did not know, what none of the people in that room could possibly have known, was that the gala they were all standing in, every flower arrangement, every candlestick, every inch of that ballroom existed because of Clara. Not James, not his family, not Arcadia Capital or any of the polished, successful people he spent his evenings performing for. Clara. Specifically, the $90 million estate her grandmother left her, quietly, deliberately, and entirely outside the reach of the man who was, at that precise moment, telling his friend Philip exactly what he thought she was worth. This isn't just a story about a voice note. It's about what happens when a woman is counted out in a room she already owns. If you believe that patience is its own kind of power, hit like before we go any further. And subscribe, because this community shows up for every woman in this story. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what happened in that ballroom, we need to go back to where this really began. To a woman named Rosalind, a beach house on the Carolina coast, and a lesson about silence that her granddaughter almost forgot she'd learned. She found a quiet corner near the hallway that led to the bathrooms, close enough to the wall that no one would notice her stop moving. She pressed play. James's voice came through the speaker the way it always did when he thought he was alone. looser, lower, stripped of the warmth he kept on for company. She could hear footsteps, a car door, the soft sound of a man rolling up his sleeves after a long evening. She was standing there tonight, holding her little sparkling water, he said, and Clara's hand tightened around her own glass before she could stop it. You know she can't even buy herself a glass of wine because I run the accounts, and I just thought, God, Philip, when did I become the man married to that? She kept her face very still. Around her, the party continued. Someone laughed near the bar. A waiter passed with a silver tray. She's wearing Margaret's dress because I made her return the one she bought. Honestly, I don't feel bad about it. You should have seen it. She's gotten so heavy since the thyroid thing. She keeps calling it a medical condition. A pause. Philip said something she couldn't make out. Then James laughed. The specific laugh she had spent 11 years believing meant he was happy. I know. She calls it a condition. I call it 11 years of not trying. There's a difference. Clara walked to the bathroom. Not quickly. Not in a way anyone would remember. She pushed through the door and stood at the sink and let the voice note keep playing. The marble counter was cold beneath her free hand. The overhead lights were the particular white of rooms designed to flatter, and they did not flatter her right now, and she did not care. James's voice dropped. The register of a man sharing something real. I've already talked to Hargrove about structuring the Arcadia holdings through my mother before we file. Clara thinks we have a joint financial life. A pause. She doesn't understand that I've been unwinding that for about 8 months. By the time she gets a lawyer, there won't be anything to find. She heard footsteps on his end. Then, quieter, almost to himself, in the voice of a man who found the whole thing faintly amusing. She still thinks I married her because I loved her. Isn't that something? The voice note ended. Clara stood at the sink for a long moment. Then she looked up. Behind her reflection, mounted across the full width of the bathroom wall, was a brushed gold banner. She had approved the font herself 3 years ago in an email she'd sent from an account James had never seen. The letters were clean and simple. Whitmore Foundation. Estorter 2019. She looked at it. Then she looked back at herself, at the borrowed dress, at the soft curve of her shoulders, at the face of a woman who had spent 11 years making herself smaller in rooms her grandmother's money had built. Something did not crack. That was the thing she would remember later. Nothing inside her broke. Instead, something that had been braced for a very long time simply released. She set the sparkling water glass down on the marble counter with both hands, the way Rosalind had taught her to set down anything worth keeping. Carefully. With intention. Not because she was fragile, because she had already decided she was taking it home. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She smoothed the front of Margaret's dress, picked up her clutch, and walked back out into the ballroom. James was near the bar, holding court with 2 men she recognized from Arcadia's website. He saw her cross the room and extended his arm, and she stepped into the space beside him the way she always had. Present, quiet, undemanding, and she smiled at the men he introduced her to, and she laughed once at something she didn't hear, and she held her glass of sparkling water and did not say a single word that mattered. He talked the whole way home. A contact he'd made, a deal that might be moving, a conversation with someone whose name she should probably remember. The city moved past the car window in lights and fragments. Clara looked at none of it. She was thinking about a beach house, about a chair worn smooth on the left armrest, about a woman who had loved her without condition and prepared for her without explanation, and who had understood, long before Clara did, exactly what kind of patience a life like this would require. To understand what that banner meant, To understand why Clara could stand in that bathroom and exhale instead of collapse, you have to go back much further than the gala. You have to go back to a woman who arrived in Charleston in 1971 with $40, a sewing kit, and a refusal to be legible to people who would use that knowledge against her. Rosalind Whitmore was not a woman who announced herself. She built things quietly, the way water shapes stone, not through force, but through patience, through the slow accumulation of correct decisions made without applause. She started with a single alterations shop on King Street, a narrow space between a hardware store and a pharmacy, and she worked it 14 hours a day for 9 years until she could afford the building it sat in, then the building beside it. By 1991, Whitmore Textile Group operated 4 manufacturing contracts across the Carolinas, employed 340 people, and appeared in no social columns whatsoever. Rosalind considered this a point of discipline, not modesty. Visibility, she believed, was an invitation. And not everyone who accepted that invitation deserved to be let in. Clara grew up watching her grandmother do business the way other children watched their parents cook, as something unremarkable and essential, a daily practice of competence. She watched Rosalind read contracts at the kitchen table without a lawyer present, and then call the lawyer afterward to confirm what she'd already understood. She watched her negotiate without raising her voice, which Clara eventually understood was not restraint, but strategy. Rosalind didn't need volume. She already knew how the conversation would end. The summer Clara turned 32, Rosalind was diagnosed with the illness that would take her in 14 months. They spent that last good summer at the beach house on Sullivan's Island, the one with the chair worn smooth on the left armrest, the one that faced the water. And it was there, on an afternoon that smelled of salt and something cooking on the stove, that Rosalind pressed a piece of paper into Clara's hand and said the thing she had been preparing to say for years. Money kept secret isn't deception, Clara. It's patience. And patience is the only power they can't take from you. Clara thought she understood what her grandmother meant. She didn't, not yet. But she would. The legal architecture came together over the following 6 months in Sylvia Drummond's office on the 14th floor of a building on Meeting Street in downtown Charleston. Sylvia was 61 then, precise in the way of a woman who had spent 4 decades ensuring that emotion never got between a client and a correct decision. She and Rosalind had worked together for 20 years. She knew what the trust was for before Rosalind finished explaining it. The terms were straightforward and ironclad. Clara would inherit the entirety of Rosalind's estate, the textile holdings, the investment accounts, the $90 million in assets accumulated across a lifetime of deliberate invisibility, through a revocable living trust registered under Clara's middle name, Rosalind, the name she had been given in honor of her grandmother and had almost never used. On every document, she was not Clara Whitmore. She was R. Whitmore, trustee, and she was bound by a condition Rosalind had written herself and Sylvia had formalized, to maintain that anonymity for 5 years from the date of inheritance. When Clara asked why, Rosalind looked at her the way she always did when Clara asked a question she already knew the answer to. "Because I want you to see who shows up for you before they know what you have, and I want you to see who doesn't." Clara met James 4 months later at a fundraising dinner for an architectural preservation society, an event she attended as herself, in a navy dress, carrying a glass of white wine, and laughing more freely than she had in months, because grief had clarified something in her about the preciousness of good evenings. James was across the room, tall and animated, telling a story that made 3 people laugh at once. He noticed her noticing and crossed the room in a way that felt like a decision rather than an accident. She found this impressive. She would think about that later. He was genuinely attentive in those early years. That is important to say, and it is important to mean it. He asked about her restoration work with real curiosity. He remembered details. He called when he said he would. On the morning of their wedding, he left a note under her coffee cup that said only, "I didn't think I'd find someone who made quiet feel like enough. Thank you." She kept it in the drawer of her bedside table for 11 years, and she does not entirely regret that. The Whitmore Foundation had been established 3 months before they met, and Clara had been placed on the Community Development Board as R. Whitmore trustee 6 weeks after that. The 5-year clock was running. James knew nothing about it because Clara had not yet told anyone, not because she was hiding it from him specifically, but because that was the agreement, and because she trusted, in those early months, that there would be time. There is something the audience should know. On the morning Clara and James signed their marriage certificate at the Charleston County Register of Deeds office on Broad Street, a new corporate entity was being filed 2 floors below in the commercial registration office. The entity was called Arcadia Capital LLC. Its registered agent was James Edward Carver. Clara did not know this. She was upstairs, signing her name in the light coming through a tall window, thinking about the note under the coffee cup. The irony is not sharp. The irony is architectural. Rosalind died 8 months into the marriage. Clara stood at her funeral on a gray October morning with her hand in James's and felt the specific grief of losing the person who had known her longest and most completely, and she was grateful in that moment for his steadiness beside her. She meant that too. Afterward, she drove alone to the beach house. She sat in Rosalind's chair for a long time. The 5-year clock, which had been running for 14 months, continued running. Outside, the water moved the way it always did. Not for anyone, not against anyone. Simply forward. Clara did not know, sitting in that chair, what the next 4 years would ask of her. She did not know what James would become when professional disappointment began to crowd out everything generous in him. She did not know about Margaret's particular talent for reframing cruelty as concern, or about a woman named Portia who did not yet work at Arcadia Capital, because Arcadia Capital was not yet the company it would grow into. She knew only what her grandmother had left her, and what her grandmother had said, and that the water outside kept moving. That was enough to begin with. It would not stay enough for long. The gala was still going. She could hear it, the low percussion of conversation and crystal, the orchestra now fully tuned and playing something measured and forgettable in the next room. Clara stood at the bathroom sink and listened to the voice note one more time, not because she needed to. She already knew every word by now, already knew the precise cadence of James's laugh after Philip said something she still couldn't make out. She played it again because she wanted to hear it the way she would hear it from now on, not as a wound, but as information. She listened to the whole thing without her hands tightening once. When it ended, she set the phone face down on the marble counter beside the sparkling water glass and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. The woman looking back at her was 44 years old, wearing her mother-in-law's dress, with soft arms she had spent years covering, and a face that had learned, somewhere in the last decade, to hold itself very still in public. The Whitmore Foundation banner hung behind her reflection in brushed gold. She did not look at it again. She didn't need to. Her grandmother had told her once that patience wasn't something you decided to have. It was something you built, slowly, the way you built anything worth keeping, by showing up to it every day without expecting the world to notice. That was what Rosalind had meant, Clara understood now, in a way she couldn't have understood it at 32. It wasn't about waiting for things to get better. It was about staying intact while they didn't. Keeping yourself whole and clear and undiluted, so that when the moment finally came, and Rosalind had always believed the moment would come, You would be ready to meet it as yourself, not as whatever the waiting had worn you down to. The moment was here. Clara was ready. She picked up the sparkling water glass, carried it out with her. The drive home passed the way it had on the way there. James talking, Clara present enough to nod at the right intervals, the city moving past her window in its indifferent way. He mentioned a contact at Meridian Partners he'd reconnected with. He mentioned the hors d'oeuvres, which had been disappointing. He did not mention the foundation, because he had never connected the name on the donor wall to the woman sitting beside him in his mother's dress. He never had. In 11 years, it had never once occurred to him to look. They were home by 11. James was asleep by 11:40. Clara lay beside him in the dark for 20 minutes, with her eyes open and her hands folded across her stomach. She was not angry. She had been on the other side of anger now for several hours, in a territory that had no name she knew of except this: clarity. The particular stillness of a woman who has stopped arguing with what is true. At 10 past midnight she got up. She moved through the house the way she always moved at night. Without turning on lights, without sound, her full hips navigating the familiar dark of a home she had organized and maintained and made livable for a decade. She went to the study and closed the door behind her, and sat in the chair at the desk that James used for appearances, but Clara used for everything real. She opened her phone. She found the contact she had not called in 2 years, since the last routine trust administration review. She pressed call. Sylvia answered on the second ring. "I think it's time," Clara said. 7 words. There was a pause on the other end. Not the pause of surprise, but the pause of a woman locating the correct folder in her mind, the one she had been keeping ready for exactly this phone call. "Your grandmother wrote a clause for this," Sylvia said. She called it the early election provision. You can invoke it within 11 days of the trust's 5-year anniversary if you have documented cause. A beat. Do you have documented cause? I have a voice note. Send it to me tonight. I'll have the paperwork drafted by Thursday. Then, in the same professional register, without softening it or making it into something it wasn't. She would not be surprised, Clara. She was very clear about that with me. She said, and I am quoting her directly, that she hoped she was wrong about him, and that if she wasn't, you would know what to do. Clara held the phone against her ear for a moment after Sylvia said goodnight. Then she set it on the desk. Then she sat very still in the dark study of the house she had kept, in the marriage she had honored, in the life she had genuinely tried to build with a man who had been, for years now, quietly boarding up the exits. She was not going to cry. Not tonight. Not for this. She sent Sylvia the voice note at 12:23 a.m. and went back to bed. She lay in the dark and did not sleep. Beside her, James breathed the easy breath of a man who believed the architecture of his life was still intact. She listened to it for a long time, not with bitterness, not with satisfaction, but with the particular attention of a woman memorizing something she was about to leave behind. In the morning, he made coffee. He slid a cup across the kitchen counter toward her and asked, without looking up from his phone, if she was all right. She'd seemed quiet last night. I'm fine, she said. She meant something else entirely. She had never meant anything more precisely in her life. 11 days later, Arcadia Capital arrived at the federal infrastructure grant hearing on Calhoun Street in downtown Charleston, carrying 3 years of preparation and a presentation deck that James had revised 4 times. They came ready to make the most important case of the firm's existence. Clara was already there. She arrived 40 minutes early. The hearing room on the 3rd floor of the Calhoun Street Federal Building was not a dramatic space. It was a rectangle of institutional furniture and fluorescent light, a long table for the board, a shorter table for the presenting party, a row of chairs along the wall for observers, a water pitcher, a clock, the particular quiet of a room that has witnessed a great many consequential things and remembered none of them. Clara settled into her seat at the board table, second from the left, and placed the sparkling water glass, wrapped carefully in a cloth inside her bag, on the floor beside her chair. She had carried it here deliberately. She did not take it out. She simply knew it was there. Sylvia sat beside her, a manila folder centered precisely in front of her, both hands resting on top of it. She did not check her phone. She did not make small talk. She was simply present, the way she had been present in every room Clara had needed her in over the past 11 days. Complete, prepared, and entirely without drama. The board chair, a man named Gerald Oates, who had run these proceedings for 9 years, called the room to order at 9 o'clock exactly. There were 6 board members present, 4 of them already familiar to Clara from quarterly meetings over the past 3 years. She had voted beside them on 12 separate applications. They knew her as R. Whitmore. They had never asked what the R stood for. The door opened at 2 minutes past 9. James came in first, carrying a leather portfolio she recognized. She had given it to him 4 Christmases ago, before things had passed the point of gifts meaning anything. Behind him came his 2 partners, David Lau and a man named Brett Costas, who Clara had seen only in photographs. And behind them, slightly separate, moving with the particular self-possession of someone who had learned to enter rooms at an angle, was Portia Vane. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer. She carried a tablet and did not look up from it as she walked in. James was scanning the room in the professional way he always scanned rooms, cataloging faces, locating allies, orienting himself for performance. His gaze moved across the board table with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years being the most prepared person in any given space. It stopped. The nameplate was standard issue. White card, black lettering, slotted into a small plastic holder. It read, R. Whitmore, Trustee, Whitmore Foundation. He read it once, then he read it again. Then, very slowly, the way a person looks up when they are not entirely certain what they will find, he raised his eyes. Clara looked back at him. She did not look away. She did not smile. She held his gaze with the steady, unhurried calm of a woman who had been sitting in this particular truth for 11 days and was entirely comfortable in it. David Lau noticed 2 seconds later. His eyes moved from James's face to the nameplate and back. Something closed in his expression. Brett Costas caught it from Lau's posture rather than from the nameplate itself. He leaned slightly back, a half-inch, the unconscious adjustment of a man recalculating. Portia looked up from her tablet last. She read the nameplate. Then she looked at Clara. Really looked, perhaps for the first time. Whatever she was searching for, she found it or didn't. Her face gave nothing back. Gerald Oates cleared his throat. We'll proceed. For the record, board members present include Dr. Susan Halley, Marcus Webb, Diane Cho, Thomas Arquette, and R. Whitmore, serving as trustee representative of the Whitmore Foundation in her 3rd year on this board. He said it the way he said everything, without emphasis, without theater, as simple administrative fact. 3rd year. James set his portfolio down on the presenting table without sound. He did not sit yet. Mr. Oates, his voice was controlled, barely. I'd like to request a brief recess before we begin. We've just begun, Mr. Carver. There may be a conflict of interest issue that warrants, if you have a conflict to disclose, you may disclose it now, on the record. Oates looked at him without particular interest. Otherwise, we'll proceed. Silence. 3 seconds of it. Then James sat down. Sylvia opened the folder. She did not stand. She did not address the room. She simply slid the first document across the table toward Gerald Oates and spoke in the flat, efficient register of someone delivering information rather than making an argument. For the record, I'm Sylvia Drummond of Drummond & Associates, Estate and Trust Counsel, representing the interests of R. Whitmore, trustee. I'm entering into the record 3 items. First, the Whitmore Family Trust Instrument, executed in 2013, establishing Clara Rosalind Whitmore as sole trustee under her middle name. The trust predates the applicant's marriage by 6 years, is registered as separate non-marital property under South Carolina Statute 20-3-630, and carries no exposure in any current or prospective divorce proceeding. She slid the second document. Second, the Foundation's board participation log for the past 3 years, confirming R. Whitmore's presence at and voting participation in 11 review sessions, including 3 sessions in which Arcadia Capital's infrastructure grant application was evaluated. The room was very still. David Lau's pen had stopped moving. Brett Costas was looking at the table. Third. Sylvia's voice did not change. It never changed. Documentation of a financial restructuring operation conducted over the past 8 months by James Carver in consultation with his personal attorney, Robert Hargrove of Hargrove Legal Group, in which marital assets were transferred to a third-party name in anticipation of divorce proceedings. This documentation has been filed this morning with Sylvia Drummond's office as supporting material in a divorce petition and has been referred to the South Carolina Bar's Ethics Division for review of the facilitating counsel. She placed the third document on the table. She did not slide this one. She set it down. The sound in the room was the sound of air. Brett Costas spoke first. Quietly, to David Lau, in the voice of a man making a decision. We need to table the application. Lau nodded once. He did not look at James. At the far end of the presenting table, Portia Vane closed her tablet. She gathered it against her chest, picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair, and stood. She did not make a scene. She did not look at James. She walked to the door and opened it and went through it, and it closed behind her with no more sound than a breath. James was still at the table. He was looking at Clara with an expression she had not seen on him before, not rage, not calculation, but something stripped of both of those, something beneath them. The expression of a man who has just understood the full shape of something he thought he knew the dimensions of. He said her name, not as a statement, as a question, as though he was asking her to confirm that this was real, that she was real, that the woman he had described to Philip as someone who still thought he'd married her for love was the same woman currently seated at a federal board table with her grandmother's name on a placard in front of her. Clara looked at him for one moment. Then she said quietly, in the voice she had found in that bathroom 11 days ago, and had not lost since, I've been on this board for 3 years, James. Gerald Oates called a 10-minute recess. People moved, chairs scraped, voices began, low and procedural, at the edges of the room. David Lau gathered his materials without speaking. Brett Costas followed him out. James stood at the presenting table. He did not move toward her. He did not move toward the door. He simply stood in the particular stillness of a man who has run out of the moves he prepared for this room, in a room he did not know his wife had been sitting in for 3 years. Sylvia closed the folder. Clara did not move from her seat. The hearing ended at 10:30. What followed did not announce itself. It arrived the way most true things arrive, quietly, incrementally, one closed door at a time. Arcadia Capital withdrew its grant application 4 days after the hearing. The withdrawal letter, filed with the Federal Community Development Office by a junior administrator named Keisha Bright, cited a material conflict of interest requiring internal review. It was a single paragraph. It contained no names. Brett Costas filed paperwork to dissolve his partnership interest in Arcadia within 3 weeks of that letter, citing irreconcilable differences in fiduciary approach. David Lau followed 11 days after that. The firm did not close dramatically. It simply stopped being a firm, the way fires stop. Not all at once, but by running out of what they needed to keep going. James's professional reputation did not collapse in a single moment. There was no public disgrace, no news item, no moment of visible ruin. What happened was quieter and more permanent than that. Calls went unreturned. Introductions that would once have been easy became unavailable. The particular social machinery that had sustained him, the lunches, the referrals, the casual mentions in the right rooms, slowed and then stilled and then stopped, the way a watch stops when the mechanism inside it finally gives way. He had built his professional life on relationships, and relationships, it turned out, were also a kind of trust instrument. They required maintenance. They required honesty. They could be withdrawn. Portia Vane was gone before the paperwork cleared. She did not call. She did not send a message. She simply was no longer available, which was, in its way, the most honest thing she had ever communicated. She had attached herself to a portfolio. The portfolio had been reclassified. She moved on with the clean efficiency of someone who has never confused proximity for investment. Margaret sent a letter. It arrived at the marital home on a Tuesday, handwritten on cream stationery in the careful script she used for correspondence, she considered important. Clara picked it up from the front table, turned it over once, and placed it in a manila envelope, which she sealed and sent to Sylvia Drummond's office with a note that said only, "File with the others." She did not know what the letter said. She did not need to. James came to the house on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the hearing. Clara heard his car in the driveway and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with both hands flat on the surface, steadying nothing in particular. Then she walked to the front door and opened it before he knocked. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing. He said her name. He said he thought they should talk. "There's nothing left to say," Clara told him. Not unkindly. Simply as a fact, the way her grandmother had always delivered facts, without apology, without theater, with the particular gentleness of someone who understands that clarity is a form of mercy. She stepped back and closed the door. She heard him stand on the porch for a long moment. Then she heard him go. The scene softened after that into something quieter. The custody agreement was settled without contest. James signed the terms Sylvia prepared without modification, which Sylvia noted was the first intelligent decision she had observed him make in 11 years, though she did not say this to Clara. She said only, "Done." The children, who were 11 and 8 and had weathered their parents' final months with the particular resilience of children who have always known more than they were told, came to the beach house for the first time in November. Clara's daughter, Nora, walked through every room slowly, touching the door frames the way her great-grandmother had always done, as if checking that things were still standing. Her son, Will, found the beach immediately and stayed there until called for dinner. Clara watched them from the kitchen window and felt something loosen in her chest that had been braced for a very long time. She donated Margaret's dress to the Rosalind Whitmore Textile Archive in Charlotte, care of the archive's director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osey, who accepted it without comment and filed it under anonymous gift. It was a good dress. It deserved to belong to someone who had chosen it. Clara had not. She kept the sparkling water glass. It sat on the kitchen windowsill of the beach house, catching whatever light came through, which in the mornings was considerable. The trust transferred into her name openly in December. No longer R. Whitmore trustee, but Clara Rosalind Whitmore, in full, on every document. She signed the final paperwork at Sylvia's office on a Wednesday afternoon and drove to Sullivan's Island in the early dark of a winter evening, the way she had driven there the night of Rosalind's funeral, 11 years ago, when the 5-year clock had just begun, and she had not yet understood what she was being given time to learn. She opened the door of the beach house and turned on the lamp in the corner. She picked up the sparkling water glass from where she had left it. She walked to the chair by the window, the one worn smooth on the left armrest from decades of a woman who had sat in exactly this spot and thought carefully about exactly the right things. And she sat down. The water was outside, doing what it always did. There is something worth saying about this story before it ends. It was never about wealth. The money was real, and the trust was real, and the documents were necessary. But none of that was the point. The point was a woman who was told, in 100 different ways and over 1,000 quiet days, that she had nothing worth counting. The point was that she knew otherwise, and held that knowledge with patience instead of bitterness, and waited for the moment when truth would not need her help to be visible. That is not a story about fortune. It is a story about what it costs to stay whole inside a life that keeps trying to make you smaller, and what it feels like when you finally stop trying to fit. If this story landed somewhere real for you, leave a comment below. Tell me what moment stayed with you longest, and as always, drop a note to let me know where you're watching from tonight. This community never fails to show up for the right people. Clara held the sparkling water glass in both hands and looked out at the water for a long time. Then she tilted her head toward the empty chair beside her, the one no one sat in, the one that had always been Rosalind's in every room she'd ever occupied, and she said very softly, in the voice of a woman who has finally come home, 11 days early, Gran. I hope that's all right. Outside, the water kept moving. It did not stop for anyone. It never had. And that, in the end, was exactly enough.